Under the pale northern sky, along the banks of the Irtysh River in western Siberia, a fragment of bone lay buried for tens of thousands of years, waiting for the moment it would be uncovered. It was not large or ornate, just part of a human thigh bone. But within its dense structure, it held an extraordinary secret. This bone belonged to a man who had walked the frozen plains roughly 45,000 years ago, at a time when our species was still new to the vast expanse of Eurasia. Scientists would later call him the Ishim Man, after the nearby town. He was an anatomically modern human, like you and me, in body and brain, yet he lived in a world that was almost unrecognizable, one where small bands of hunters followed the migrations of mammoths and reindeer, and where other human species, like the Neanderthals, still roamed. The discovery of his remarkably well-preserved remains opened a rare genetic window into that distant past. From his bone, scientists were able to extract DNA so intact and complete that it became the oldest high-quality genome ever sequenced from a modern human. What it revealed would reshape our understanding of those first great journeys out of Africa. The genetic story written in his cells begins in a time when humans had only recently left the warm landscapes of Africa and passed through the bottleneck of the Middle East, spreading into the cold, open lands of Eurasia. These early explorers encountered other human species along the way, and in the case of Ishim's ancestors, they met Neanderthals. The traces of those encounters were still fresh in his genome. About 2.3% of his DNA came from Neanderthals, the same general amount found in all non-Africans today. But there was something unusual about it. The Neanderthal DNA in his genome existed in long, unbroken stretches, unlike the shorter fragmented sequences seen in modern humans. Over generations, DNA from different lineages is shuffled and cut into smaller pieces by recombination, so the longer the segments, the more recent the mixture. By measuring the length of these Neanderthal sequences, scientists could estimate when the interbreeding had taken place. For Ishim, it was astonishingly close in time, just 7 to 13,000 years before he lived, placing the meeting between his people and the Neanderthals at around 50 to 60,000 years ago. That timing points squarely to the Middle East, the gateway where modern humans and Neanderthals would have crossed paths as the first great waves of migration moved out of Africa. Ishim's DNA captures a unique moment between two major events in human history: the first mixing with Neanderthals and the later splitting of Eurasian populations into the ancestors of today's Europeans, East Asians, and Siberians. He belonged to a population that had spread far into the north but had not yet diverged into those separate branches. This makes him genetically basal to both Europeans and East Asians, meaning he sits near the base of their family tree before the split. But the story becomes more intriguing when we compare him to another early human from a different corner of Asia, the Tianyuan man, discovered near Beijing and dating to about 40,000 years ago. Tianyuan also came from that first wave out of Africa, but by the time he lived, his lineage was already drifting closer to the ancestors of modern East Asians and Native Americans. Ishim, by contrast, represents an earlier stage, before those distinctions had taken hold. Despite the lack of a direct, unbroken line to living people, Ishim's DNA fingerprints have not been entirely erased. Recent studies of modern Siberians, particularly groups in the eastern regions like the Evenks, Yakuts, and Buryats, show that they carry a significant amount of ancestry related to him, up to 38% in some cases. This doesn't mean they descend from Ishim himself, but rather from a closely related population that shared much of his genetic makeup. The ancient Siberian landscape appears to have been a vast meeting ground, where early humans from multiple directions mixed. Some of these groups would contribute to the ancestors of Native Americans, others would move west toward Europe, and some would remain, adapting to the cold open steppe. The genetic echoes of that time still ripple through people living there today.
The preservation of Ishim's bone not only allowed scientists to study his ancestry, it gave them a glimpse of what he may have looked like. By examining the genes linked to pigmentation, researchers inferred that he likely had intermediate skin color, darker than most Europeans today, but lighter than sub-Saharan Africans, somewhere between tan and olive, well suited to the moderate sunlight of northern latitudes. His hair was almost certainly black or very dark brown, and his eyes were brown as well. In the cold grasslands of Pleistocene Siberia, his features would not have stood out from those of modern Mongolian or indigenous Siberian peoples. It is a reminder that many of the traits we associate with particular regions today, pale skin in northern Europe, lighter eyes in some populations, are relatively recent adaptations, shaped long after Ishim's time. Yet even with this clear genetic portrait, many questions remain about Ishim's life and the fate of his people. He lived during an age of expansion, but also of uncertainty. Climate shifts, resource scarcity, and competition with other human groups may have played a role in their disappearance. By 40,000 years ago, new populations were sweeping across Eurasia, some carrying different genetic lineages that would go on to dominate. It is entirely possible that Ishim's people were gradually absorbed into these incoming groups, their distinct identity dissolving over generations, leaving only traces in the DNA of those who came after. What makes his story remarkable is that he stands at the crossroads of human prehistory, a witness to the moment our species had just begun to truly explore the world. Through his genome, we can follow the threads that connect us to a time when humanity was young, diverse, and constantly moving into the unknown. His life and the clues left in his bones remind us that our journey as a species is not a straight line, but a web of branching paths, some ending abruptly, others weaving together to form the story of us all. From the genetic crossroads where Ishim once stood, the human story continued to branch in ways both subtle and profound. Thousands of years after his lifetime, Central Siberia would be home to new populations that still carried whispers of his genetic heritage. Among the most significant were the ancient North Eurasians, represented by individuals like the 24,000-year-old Malta boy and the 17,000-year-old Afontova Gor II child, both discovered in Siberia. These people lived long after Ishim, yet their DNA contained elements from that same early population he belonged to. The ancient North Eurasians would themselves leave an extraordinary legacy, contributing to the ancestry of Native Americans, parts of Europe, and later Siberian groups. In this way, even though Ishim's own people disappeared, some of the genetic threads from their time were woven into populations that would thrive far into the future. If we move westward in time and space, other ancient individuals add more pieces to this puzzle. The Kostenki 14 man in Russia, living around 37,000 years ago, carried a blend of early European ancestry and traces of a basal Eurasian lineage that Ishim did not possess. The Sunhia individuals from a few thousand years later seem to represent a different wave, mixing both Western and Siberian influences. These differences show that Eurasia during the Upper Paleolithic was not dominated by a single people, but was a complex mosaic of migrating and mixing groups. While some of these communities would contribute directly to modern populations, others, like Ishim's, would fade into the background, their identity dissolving, but their genes persisting in fragments. Eastward, the story takes a different turn. The Tianyuan man, living about 5,000 years after Ishim, near present-day Beijing,
shows no genetic ties to Kostenki or Sunghir. Instead, he is closely linked to the ancestors of modern East Asians and Native Americans. This tells us that soon after Isham's time, Eurasia was already dividing into distinct genetic corridors, one leading east toward East Asia and the Americas, the other stretching west toward Europe. Isham existed before that split, making him a rare snapshot of a time when these paths had not yet diverged. Modern genetic studies reinforce this picture. Today's Siberian groups, especially in the East, carry a significant portion of ancestry related to Isham's people, while Native Americans show a mixture that includes both ancient North Eurasian and East Asian components. The ancient Siberian steppe was a vast meeting ground, a place where populations from different directions intersected and exchanged genes. The people who lived there would play a crucial role in populating not just Siberia, but distant continents, as their descendants crossed into the Americas thousands of years later. Even Isham's paternal line, the Y chromosome, offers clues. Early studies placed him in haplogroup K2, a root from which many Eurasian male lineages descend. More refined analysis has since narrowed this to haplogroup NO, a branch that would eventually split into N, common in Siberians and some northern Europeans, and O, dominant in East Asia. This suggests that his male lineage had already begun drifting toward what we now call East Eurasian populations. It is another subtle thread tying him to modern Siberians and East Asians, a connection that has survived in the deep time between his life and ours. And then there are the environmental challenges his people faced. Around 39,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption known as the Campanian ignimbrite blanketed parts of Eurasia in ash, likely causing dramatic drops in temperature and disrupting ecosystems. Events like this may have accelerated the turnover of populations, wiping out some groups while giving others an opportunity to expand into newly emptied territories. It is possible that Isham's people were among those who could not adapt quickly enough, their culture and way of life disappearing as new waves of humans spread across the landscape.
From the shape of his skull and the genetic clues to his appearance, we can picture Ishim walking the open steppe, with dark eyes scanning the horizon, black hair catching the cold wind, and skin suited to the pale sunlight of the far north. His world was one of endurance and adaptation, of following the great herds across vast distances, of surviving in a land where the winters were long and the summers brief. Every decision his people made, to follow a river, to hunt in a new valley, to form alliances or avoid strangers, was part of the delicate dance of survival in the Ice Age. In the end, Ishim Man was not the founder of a great dynasty or the patriarch of a living population. He was one thread in the tapestry of humanity, a thread that might have been lost completely if not for the remarkable preservation of his bone and the science that could read its code. His genome is like a time capsule, carrying the memory of a people who lived in the fragile space between the first emergence of modern humans from Africa and the formation of the great populations we recognize today. Through him, we see that human history is not a straight road, but a river that branches, rejoins, and sometimes disappears underground, only to surface again far away. The Ishim Man story is a reminder of how much we have yet to discover about ourselves, and how every ancient bone has the potential to change our understanding of where we come from. His genetic ghost still walks among us, in the DNA of Siberian herders, in the genetic patterns of Native Americans, and in the deep structure of our chromosomes. He lived in a time before we were divided into nations or continents, when the human family was still finding its place in the world. If this journey into the deep past has made you see our shared history in a new way, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think it would have been like to live in Ishim's world? And don't forget to subscribe to Prehistoric Medievals, where the next chapter of our ancient story is always waiting to be told.